I remember that famous quote of Carl Jung, which is one of my most favorite. So he said that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Diba, we would normally say, when we say life begins at 40, there's parang an implication that that's the time that you will start to have midlife issues or even midlife crisis. But midlife, or the second half of life, is actually more of a psychological moment than a chronological moment. And when I say psychological moment, we're talking about psychological issues that dawn on a person. As I say and talk about in my workshop, it's the critical questions that come to us that we start to focus on, and that's when we can say that one is experiencing midlife. Now, with regard to midlife crisis, it's a phenomenon that happens commonly, as the name suggests, in midlife. So primarily, it's a psychological phenomenon. And it is usually brought about by certain shifts in the psyche or changes in an individual's thinking. Most common of which would be the sudden realization that one is nearing the latter years of one's life. And of course, with that realization, there's also the greater appreciation of one's mortality, where we are all going to go anyways. No? That is on the physical plane, as we all know it. And I think that's really the most challenging of it all in that phase. It is the realization that life and its possibilities are not endless. And that there are a lot of things, a lot of life's goals that will be left unaccomplished or unrealized. And so in response to that, what happens is that the person starts to feel a sense of urgency to do a lot of things before time runs out. We have that urgency to do a lot of things. So we engage in a lot of things. We panic, and sometimes that is the cause for us to want to accomplish a lot of things before time runs out. Yeah. It just hits you. It can definitely come earlier. Kasi I think that 40, we kind of think that 40 is the midpoint of an entire lifetime, diba? That's why we say life begins at 40. But in reality, some midlife issues or some issues about the second half of life can actually come much earlier. I've had patients or clients who come to me in their early 30s who are dealing with midlife issues. So like I mentioned earlier, it's not a chronological moment. It's not about a specific age, but it's more of a psychological state. It hits everybody, but I think there's also that general rule na when one is very much accomplished in life, I kind of notice that it hits them a little harder. Because what I think primarily, it's because midlife is about slowing down in a lot of aspects. That's physically, but there's the physical or physiological aspects of aging. And of course, emotionally and psychologically, there are these new issues that one needs to deal with. So, yeah. So basically, what are the manifestations of a midlife or midlife crisis? So, from the psychological perspective, more so from the Jungian perspective, the manifestations, or if you want to call it symptoms of midlife, they're always two-pronged. So on one hand, which I think is how we often think about midlife, or typically think about midlife, one may go into self-sabotaging or even self-destructive behaviors. Like one can sexually act out, or one can have people can have affairs with other individuals half their age. Some would be distracted by a lot of fleeting interests to the detriment of one's job and one's career. So there are some people who would neglect their jobs and careers in exchange of some fleeting and superficial stuff. On the other hand, so I said it's two-pronged. So on the other hand, midlife is it's a potentially enriching phase. So for instance, with that realization that time is running out, one may decide to take up a romantic language course, like enroll in a French class or an Italian language class. One may learn how to dance the flamenco, or I want to go to a wild safari in South Africa. So one thing for sure is that midlife is a call to action. It's a deciding point. So imagine yourself being in an intersection or a fork in the road. So you may either go in this direction and continue whatever it is that you have been doing for the past decades of your life, or you may go into this direction and do something different. So as I was saying earlier, it's really a potentially life-transforming phase or experience or phenomenon. So there are a lot of changes that take place in midlife. So that goes for work, relationships. So for instance, in relationship, it totally changes the dynamics of our relationships with people. So for instance, as a child of a parent, sometimes there can be a reversal of roles. So in midlife, instead of your parents taking care of you, sometimes you need to start taking care of them because of all of these. They themselves are also dealing with with issues of aging, and that goes with the physical aspects of it. So for work, I guess by virtue of the fact that, kasi the psychological agenda of the first half of life is different, very different from the psychological agenda of the second half. What do I mean by that? So, in the first half of life, we are normally externally driven. So we are directed towards action, achievement, and basically just satisfying and fulfilling the needs and the wants of the ego. And what does that mean? Diba, in the first half of life, our idea of a good future is basically to prepare for it, and that means getting high grades in school, and then maybe after that, landing a high-paying job, and being financially stable, and perhaps later on, finding the right person to settle down with. But all of these things I'm talking about are mere carriers or containers that we project our feelings of happiness to. What do I mean by that? I guess the most concrete example I can give is material wealth. So we say, if and when I become rich, or if and when I have a lot of money, is the time when I'll be happy. Diba? But all we really need to do is to look around us and ask the question, how much does a life of material affluence really work? And of course, I'm talking about at a deep or more authentic level. But I guess the sad reality is that our modern culture reinforces that kind of thinking more and more as time advances, I think. So that's what happens in the first half. Now, in the second half of life, the psychological agenda is very different. If in the first half, our energies are externally directed, in the second half, it calls us to strike a balance between our worldly pursuits and tending to the inner life or the inner world, as some depth psychologists would refer to. In fact, Jung goes on to say that one of the callings of the second half of life or midlife is to reconnect with the divine within. Kasi that's one of the goals of midlife. It's really to connect to that deeper and wiser aspects of ourselves. For the most part, it's an unconscious process. But yun nga, sinasabi that what's important is for us to be conscious about it. Na okay, ito pala yun. Na the reason why there is this urge for me to do a lot of things is because there is a need, an internal need for me to expand myself and my life. Medyo it's a critical period because pwede kasing ang mangyari is we go into a lot of things and spread ourselves too thin. So as I was saying earlier, we need to distinguish fleeting interests from more meaningful endeavors, or else you will be kalat. I think the common misconception for a lot of us is that midlife is something that's maladaptive or even an abnormality. But as I was saying earlier, if we're going to look at it from the perspective na life, an entire lifetime is divided into phases and stages, and each phase and stage involves a conflict that we need to resolve and we need to traverse, then midlife is no exception. It has its own conflicts that we need to be able to resolve. So I guess to answer your question directly, I wouldn't really classify midlife, or even formally, it's not classified as an illness or a clinical problem. I remember that famous quote of Carl Jung, which is one of my most favorite. So he said that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie.